Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown Podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you for another week. It's a little rainy outside if you're here in Utah, which is great. Don't get me wrong, I've enjoyed golfing pretty much every day this spring. We'll call it winter even, for that matter, that it was supposed to be. But, happy to be able to have the rain, to be able to have that moisture that we need and get us to where we need to be. So always a good day for that. A lot to discuss today. A lot of different things going on, obviously, mostly related around Utah football. I'm not going to get really into much of the basketball transfer portal. It's still happening, and even though the portal hasn't even opened yet, so I'm going to do a little bit more with that later as the portal gets in there. But there are a few guys and women in the portal, so we'll touch on that more when we kind of get closer to that. So probably next week, and we'll see what happens there. So today's episode, we're going to talk Utah canceling its spring game and whether that's a good idea. We'll take a look at how Kevin McGiven, Utah's new offensive coordinator, views his QBs and how he wants to utilize them. And then we'll top it off with some spring camp notes and some takeaways. So we'll jump into that. But first, let me tell you about our partners at Canyon View Credit Union. Big dreams don't just belong in your imagination. At Canyon View Credit Union, we help turn those dreams into reality. From application to celebration, we're by your side every step of the way because home isn't just a place, it's the people you share it with. At Canyon View Credit Union, flexible options and expert guidance help you create a home that's truly yours, the perfect place to gather and belong. Guiding you home, Canyon View Credit Union. To learn more details, visit canyonviewcu.com. All right, let's jump into the action. So we're going to talk a little spring game stuff. Right. So last week, Utah announced that it is doing away with its spring game. And I'm going to get into why that's the case here shortly. But what will happen is, let me first bring this up. So you're going to see Utah announced that they're going to do a 22 for Utah Fan Day. So essentially, they're replacing the spring game with a fan day. It'll take place on Saturday, April 18th. You're seeing this on YouTube if you're watching. This will take place from 4:30 to 6 p.m. at the Spence Eccles Fieldhouse at Rice Eccles Stadium. So you'll get an opportunity to meet the players. Let's zoom in a little bit here. Fun little graphic there if you want to look at that. Little fancy stuff, and then we'll get into the details here. So during that time, there will be an autograph session with the entire team. They're not allowing you to bring in memorabilia. You just get a poster and they will sign it there. So you'll get an opportunity to be able to meet any player you want and get an opportunity to be able to, get that autograph there. There'll be a kids fun zone, a 22 forever coat drive, drop off, some live interviews and some music. So they're trying to make this a fan fest that you usually have in the fall, but this will be solely specific for the Utah football players and all that. So it's going to be a little bit different of a vibe. You're not going to have a spring game and what that's going to be. So Utah Morgan Scalley specifically, opted to be able to have an extra practice. So what happens here is in spring, each team is allowed 15 practices during the spring period, true team practices. There's other positional drills and other stuff that teams can take part in, and those happen all year. There's certain hours that they can do, and then the coaches can be involved. But this is an opportunity for the coaches to be able to just have full 15 practices. And if you decide to take part in a spring game, and quite honestly, not every program in the country has done this over the years. Some do not participate in a spring game, and it's obviously going a little bit less that way for programs around the country. And so if you do decide to have a spring game, that does count as one of your 15 practices. So, it's a glorified scrimmage. The coaches are holding back a lot. They're not going to give their full tape. But more and more, as the years have developed and the transfer portal has changed things, things have taken place where, you don't get the opportunity to be able to have the same consistency that you traditionally would have. You don't have the opportunity to be able to make it you can't really put your schemes in place because you want to hold things back. There's a lot of this film, especially a few years ago when everything was broadcast. When Utah was in the Pac-12, this was broadcast on Pac-12 networks. It's now broadcast on ESPN. There's a lot of different things there that limit these coaches in terms of what they want to do and making sure that they don't put all the tape on there. So what would happen is you usually saw second, third team guys, even deeper on the depth chart, as they tried to maximize their potential on the field, right, and get their shot and show out. But this turned into, up and coming freshmen or sophomores that would pop off, or you'd hear good things about them in spring, and then suddenly you see it on film, and now you've got other programs around the country tampering and trying to get them into the portal. Now you may be asking yourself, well, the portal doesn't exist in spring anymore. This is the first year where there is no spring transfer portal, but now there's this quasi transfer portal era. And we've talked about this on the podcast. So this shouldn't be new to some of you that listen to this. But what essentially can happen, and this took place with Jake Retzlaff last year at BYU, obviously different circumstances. He was going to be suspended for a majority of the season and would be forced to sit. He unenrolled from school and then walked on to Tulane to be able to kind of have that opportunity. And with NIL changing the game, you don't really need to rely on the scholarship. And so the NCAA doesn't really have any way to prohibit this, right? There can be ways to prohibit this in the future. Those mechanisms just don't exist right now. And so what happens is a guy can go pop off in spring camp, and you see that on film, and suddenly you have an opportunity where teams are going to poach this player. They're going to come in there and they're going to say, hey, we'll offer you more. A lot of these teams out there, you're always in constant communication with the players that you've been recruiting. So whether they committed to your school from the jump or not, there's always going to be kind of this connection. And there's nothing coaches can do to prohibit that, right? Like every coach is going to continue to try to maintain a relationship of guys that they want to continue with. And there may be some guys out there who, maybe let's say Utah, for example, has a player that maybe they're on the fringe with, right? And let's say he goes to a group of 6 school. Let's say, because San Jose State is a team that Utah pulled a lot from this year. Let's go with San Jose State. Last year it was New Mexico. This player decides to commit to San Jose State, and you see them having success in spring camp, and then you see him pop off in a spring game. Now maybe there's potential where you're like, okay, maybe they really did live up to the expectations. Now if they come into our system, maybe we can get them in a better opportunity, and now we can see a little bit more tape on them than just at the high school level, right? And so that's where, I'm not saying Utah does this, but this is where other programs are doing this, where you can now maybe tamper and have those same connections and say, hey, remember how we were high on you before? We'd love to get you in the program. We think we can make X work for you. We need another, athlete to our room. And suddenly you come in and this guy unenrolls at San Jose State, and he enrolls at Utah as a walk-on, and Utah can pay him whatever they need to under the NIL rules. And suddenly you've created this quasi transfer portal. That's essentially one of the biggest reasons why Utah does not want to have a spring game, is for those situations. You don't need programs that, are viewed as higher or bigger programs than Utah coming in here and swooping some of your, talented freshmen that you like. You don't want them to be able to come in and do that, or sophomores, whatever it may have you, any player for that matter. Utah had this happen to him, though I'm going to use the legally term because anything is legal in this world. But last year, when your star wide receiver decided to go to USC, star being a loose term because he was expected to be a star wide receiver, but you didn't see any of that, and so it's tough to know. But regardless, you're trying to prohibit anybody leaving your program and trying to maintain that roster. And at the end of the day, these guys have any potential that they want to be able to move. It doesn't even have to mean that another program is poaching them or tampering with them. It could just be a player says, I don't like this vibe. I don't mesh well. I don't see an opportunity for me. And they can have that opportunity available to them where they unenroll and go. And there's nothing that Utah or any other program can do to prevent that at this moment. Now, there are mechanisms in place where the NCAA is trying to rule against this, where they're going to prohibit coaches from being able to take these players, or significantly penalize them if you do take a player this way. And so if it does pass here, it's supposed to be voted on, I believe, the middle of this month by the top NCAA committees and stuff. This would essentially prohibit a coach from taking a player unless they take a penalty, which would generally incur a 6-game suspension. So that coach could not coach for 6 games, the first 6 games of the season. You also lose, if I remember the latest one, it's 5 roster spots on your upcoming season, as well as you take a hit to your athletic department funds. And so it's hugely deterrent on these guys picking them up. Players can still do that, but anybody that picks them up could significantly face a massive penalty if this passes. Now, quite honestly, this is going to get challenged in the court. And so it's one of those things that even if it passes. Even if it does pass, this is one that's probably going to get challenged in the court because you're restricting free trade. I'm not going to get into all that. I'm not a lawyer. I was going to try to be one day, but clearly not smart enough. Now that's why you're listening to a dumb guy on a podcast. This prohibits them up into a point, but the courts have to rule on if it is a restriction of free trade, meaning a player can go wherever they need to be able to make more money or better opportunities. And if you restrict that, what does that mean? At the end of the day, unless there's a collective bargaining agreement or things that the athletes and the coaches and the player, everything everybody agrees to, everything is a restriction of free trade, quite honestly. And so, the only thing that courts have really ruled in favor for the NCAA lately are eligibility cases in terms of saying you can't just continue to play in college forever. But anything that restricts free trade or opportunities to make money elsewhere or move elsewhere is going to get challenged. And so this reason makes it really difficult for coaches to be able to want to put out this product, right? You don't want to put out this spring game product and suddenly have your players go. So, with that said, is this a smart move for Utah? TBD, right? I mean, I think there's opportunities here where coaches can get an opportunity to see more, but you can also have a closed door scrimmage where you don't have that same system where people are getting to see it firsthand. It's not broadcast. Yeah, media may be invited, but even depending on how they, us media broadcast that may change in terms of, what it is. Like it's easy for me to say, oh, this guy's popping off in practice, but if you see it, it's another thing, right? And so I think that's the difference here is trying to be able to make that work. So as frustrating as it is for a lot of fans, especially when this becomes kind of your first look at a team and it's exciting, it's football in spring, it's not highly attended, so it's not like it's this massive thing where the entire Rice Cycle Stadium is filled out and sold out. But at the same time, for the diehards and the people that just want a good vibe of football in spring, it's a blow, right? And there's no way about that where you can say that it's a great move because it's tough. You want to be able to get that buy-in. Morgan Scalley wants the buy-in, right? Like he's not going around here saying like, how can we restrict fans from understanding who our players are? If anything, he wants more involvement, but at the same time, he has to protect his program. And so at the end of the day, as much as this hurts to be able to not have that opportunity, it's a moment where Utah has to protect itself. And, I'm all for being able to have more things out there. As a member of the media, I want as much out there as possible. But at the same time, I also understand that you can't just give everything, right? You can't hand over the practice plans and you can't hand over everything, or else you just don't have a competitive advantage. And so I think in this case specifically, I think Utah is making the right move, right? And I think this is one of those things where maybe it's not super controversial, but at the same time, you've got to do whatever you can to maintain your roster. And especially this year where it's Morgan Scalley's first season, he has to do whatever he can to maintain his roster in the best way that he possibly can. With that said, as I mentioned, he's trying to give opportunities where you can still get access to these players. That's why they're doing a fan day for the Utah football team, where if you want to go get Devin Dampier's autograph and, potentially get a photo, I don't know how that's going to work, but get a photo, there's going to be opportunities there. So you may not see Dampier and Bird Ficklin lining up, in the backfield or doing whatever. You still get an opportunity to meet. So it's trading one thing for another. It's tough. Obviously, this is a situation that Scally would love to showcase his program. He would love to be able to get more fan involvement and try to get people to buy into the program early because that only helps him, right? But at the end of the day, he has to protect himself. And so as much as this can be controversial for some people and they think it's a bad move and why is Morgan doing this? He's got to protect himself. And especially this year, he's going to have the scrutiny on him, right? You're replacing a guy that just finished the last season 11-2. He'd been with the program for 21 years. And yeah, there's some give and take with Kyle Whittingham and the program. But at the same time, it's now Morgan Scalley's program. and he's got to do whatever he can to maintain that, right? There's going to be a massive spotlight on him. And any trouble that there is, if Utah loses a game, that first game, there's going to be a massive spotlight on him to say, was it because Utah was just the better, a better team that stumbled, or was it a team that you just got beat by a better team? Was this Morgan Scalley's problem? Was this some of the coaches' problem? What does that be? What is, I'm really struggling today, man. It's spring break and my kids, they whatever. It's interesting nonetheless. But I think, he's got to do whatever he can to one, get buy-in from the fans and try to get the involvement from them, but at the same time maintain whatever he's doing. So maybe I've just repeated myself there a ton, but at the end of the day, he's going to do what's best for the program. I think, he's probably going to want a little bit of grace that way to say, hey, I know this is a tough situation. He's a guy that has been watching spring games since he was a little kid, right? And then participated then when he was at Utah. So it's not like he's just trying to change things to change things. It's more just trying to maintain his roster. So if I went too long on that, I apologize. We're going to get into the meat of some stuff, but I think at the end of the day, it's a good move, and it's tough. But at the same time, I think for Scally to move forward, this is probably the best opportunity. So with that, let's transition here to Kevin McGiven. Kevin McGiven is Utah's new offensive coordinator, comes here from Utah State, a guy that's a veteran offensive play caller. He's done a lot. He's been around the block, has a lot of Utah ties in terms of the state. Obviously, was just at Utah State. So there are a lot of Utah ties. He's got some players on the roster that he's coached already, Braden Pagan being one, Kyrie Scholes when he was at San Jose State. So, there's connections here, but it's bringing in a guy that has an opportunity to be able to keep Utah moving in the right trajectory, right? The biggest question, in my opinion, is what does Utah look like with its offense? Kevin McGiven, Morgan Scalley, what do they want to do, right? For years, you've been used to a pretty methodical, structured system under Kyle Whittingham and his offensive play callers. Some of it has been good. Some of it has been really rough and hasn't worked, but you're getting a new regime where we don't fully know what that looks like. Now, offensive coordinators don't stray too far from what they know, right? Like, you've got to be comfortable in what you do, assuming that it works. If it doesn't work, yeah, these offensive coordinators are trying their best to be able to change and get, or at least the best ones are. They're trying to change and try to get something that is going to help make problems for the defense. But if you stay in the same thing and it's not working and you continue with that, you're going to be fired, right? So the job term is limited. But McGiven has had success. He's been able to do what he can at whatever program he's been at. This is his opportunity now to be at the Power Four level, where he gets an opportunity to have a dynamic tandem in quarterbacks that can already lift Utah to another level than maybe what he's had in years past. Last year he had Bryson Barnes, and all Utah fans are familiar with Bryson Barnes. But he was able to take Bryson Barnes, who has always been a solid player. No shade on Bryson. I love the guy. I think he was always great for Utah, but he's not at that high level as some of these other players, like a Devin Dampier can be, or a Bird Ficklin can be. But he got him to be one of the best quarterbacks in the Mountain West. And barring some injuries and some other situations, honestly could have been a player of the year candidate for the Mountain West. And so there's a true development here in what he wants to do. And that's where Kevin McGiven is coming in here, is he wants to develop these quarterbacks. He's seen the tape. He knows what type of athlete Devin Dampier is. He knows what type of athlete Bird Ficklin is. So there's not a lot of surprise there, but it's trying to transition that into being a different style quarterback, not in a way where you take it away, right? Like, sometimes you'll see these offensive coordinators where the quarterback is really dynamic in the run game, and then they just completely take them out of that and force them to be a pocket passer. That's not what he's trying to do. It's more trying to take the games that they already have and structure it in a way that helps them develop and become a complete player. So with this, McGiven last week told us that he wants both of these quarterbacks, and we're going to talk both because this is how the program is going to view it. There is obviously Devin Dampier as the starter, but Bird Ficklin is much more of a factor as a backup than most backups are, right? Because of his dynamic abilities on the field that we saw last year, you're going to find ways to get him on the field, whether that means lining him up somewhere, whether that means putting him in the backfield as the QB, whether you're putting both of them on. This isn't anything new. Utah utilized this last year with them, right? Sometimes you'd flex out Dampier or Bird out into the wide receiver spot. We didn't really see them do much in terms of, being pass catchers or whatever that may have you, but they're trying to provide some flexibility for them where any situation can break down and they can do a lot more. I think under McGiven, you're going to see a lot more of that. You're going to see a lot more of the two quarterbacks in some sort of schemes, right? Just because you can utilize their talent. And as good as both of them are, if you have both of them on the field, that becomes a headache for a lot of these teams. Both can roll out. Both of them can get, what they need to in the run game. Both can be good passers. And it's all about just creating a complete quarterback for these guys where it's not just fixating on one thing. Many times last year, especially late in the season, you knew if Bird was under center, there was most likely going to be a run play, right? And he obviously was dynamic and had ability where he could kind of split the defender and take it to the house. But that's going to get much tougher now that he's a known commodity. And so it's finding ways to utilize both of their strengths in a way that doesn't tip the hand, right? If Bird's in the backfield, does that mean he's going to always run, or is he going to be a passing quarterback at that time? Is he going to be flexed out as a wide receiver and can be a pass catcher? What is it going to be? To me, you also can't utilize this as an empty situation. There was times last year where Devin is under center and then Bird is flexed out wide, and you just kind of wasted your ability to be able to have a true wide receiver. That, essentially you're playing on 10 on 11, right? Because now you have a guy where they're not probably going to throw it to Bird, and they never showed anything where they're going to throw it to him. And so in that case, those defenses look, now we're just playing 11 on 10. All we have to do is focus on that. If we get into the backfield with Devin, we're playing a game where it's so much easier. So if they utilize those schemes, you have to find ways to be able to do it in a way that actually utilizes them instead of just using them as kind of a dummy prop to put 11 players on the field. I think Kevin McGiven is much more intent on doing that. If he utilizes both of these players, he can't be too gimmicky, right? Like, you can't have both of them on the field at the same time, or else, it can cause some problem. And maybe you can, and maybe there's a scenario where it works, but all it takes is one of those guys going down, and then suddenly your quarterback room is very limited because now you have two true freshmen as your backup. So there has to be some smart play here. You can't get into a situation where Utah was a few years ago, where you're on your fifth string quarterback hoping to win games. You got to keep Devin healthy. You got to keep Bird healthy. Yeah, you can lose one in theory, but at the same time, you lose a lot of your flexibility if one of those guys goes down. So they've got to be smart about this. So getting back to this, in terms of how McGiven wants to create this total quarterback, he says he wants to create a total quarterback in the sense of decision-making, developing their processes and reads. He really wants to get them into true full field progressions under certain concepts, right? So for example, last year, Devin Dampier, there was a lot of flexibility, but it was a lot of, one or two reads, right? This player goes here, you throw it to him if he's available. If not, go here, right? That's true progressions where you can come out in terms and say, okay, I'm going to go. But it was much more structured in terms of, okay, here's where you can go. If it doesn't, it breaks down, you can utilize your legs. Whereas McGiven, there's going to be much more situationality to it, where there are certain reads at times, but it's going to be much more of a true full progression. So getting more to that NFL style where you have to go through your progressions, where you have to go through your reads and say, okay, he's covered. Can I make this? Can I do that? This opens up Dampier to a lot more turnovers, but it also opens him up to be a lot more potent in his game. This is where they're trying to get Dampier to develop, right? And part of their pitch to keeping Dampier, especially under McGiven, was developing him as a full complementary quarterback, right? He has an ideal to go to the NFL, and you can argue the merits of that, or if he's able to do that. I think we still haven't kind of touched on if he's able to. If you're looking at last year, there's still more that needs to happen before that can even be a possibility. But if he can make those strides this year and he can develop under McGiven, there can be a real potential where he can get to the NFL. It's still an uphill battle for him, especially because of his size. But at the same time, there's an opportunity available to him if he can do it. And that's where he wants McGiven to develop him. So he doesn't want to be this one trick pony where, yeah, he can get these intermediate routes, which he was really good at, and get those out quickly. But then when it breaks down, he runs out and he does whatever he needs to, right? He wants to be able to develop into that complete player. And so the way that they're going to try to incorporate a lot of that into him is going through those full progressions while still being able to utilize his strengths. So, for example, if he has to roll out of the pocket, it's trying to find ways where he can still kind of go through his progressions, go through his reads, and still be accurate on the run. He can be pretty accurate on the run, but it's maintaining that consistency. It's not getting happy feet, right? Several times last year, he'd be back in the end of back in the pocket, and there was several factors that limited him simply because of his injuries. The hernia injuries, the ankle injuries. There was things that made it difficult for him. But as the season developed, you kind of lost a lot of the structure from him because he had to do more. More was on his plate. Brian Davis was injured for a while. He didn't have his security blanket there. Larry Simmons stepped up, and so you had some opportunities there. Dallin Bentley was solid. You had other guys. Creed Whittemore stepped up, but it was more trying to rely on Devin, being Devin. And so you got a lot of happy feet back there where he's back in the pocket as he's looking to make the pass, and he just he's not fully balanced essentially. And so he's throwing in complex ways that aren't really advantageous to who he can be. He's trying to limit the injuries that he's feeling. So it got to be a little bit happenstance back there where it just wasn't consistent. They're trying to get him to be much more consistent this year in that kind of stuff, right? It's the small little technique things. It's being able to, have solid feet, not be so happy, with dancing around back there. Now, when things break down, you can, but there's structure to it, right? And there's trying to find different things that benefit him that way. And so it's going through those full progressions, going through all those stuff, while still recognizing that if something does break down and he doesn't feel comfortable making a certain read, there are opportunities where he can obviously still run. And he's very talented at doing that and making guys miss and doing whatever he needs to. But it is trying to get him to become a much more complete player, especially in that passing game. Now, as part of this, though, McGiven is looking at both of these players, and he's not trying to reinvent the wheel to some extent with what they do. He saw how successful both of these players were last year, and he doesn't want to take that away. My biggest example here is you look at a guy like Noah Fafita at Arizona. First year comes out as a freshman, was phenomenal. One of the quarterbacks that everybody looked like, okay, this is going to be a star of the league or even the country, and suddenly it just didn't work that way. And part of that was they came in there and they took him out of the run game. Now, he developed as a passer, but at the same time, he didn't incorporate a lot of the things that made him so successful. And so that made it a difficult challenge for him to be able to be the same type of player. Now, Fafita's limited in a lot of the things that he can do as well. But even last year, you saw him take that step up because he became a much more of a complete player. That's what they're hoping to get with Dampier and Bird for that matter. Trying to incorporate still what they're successful at, but not utilizing that as kind of the safety net, so to speak, right? Is you not that Devin necessarily looked to run all the time and say, okay, he was going to call his own shot, but at the same time, you want to create a situation where you're going through those progressions, you're understanding what you can do, and then in case of emergency, you can run. Now there may be some designed runs, you're going to get that, but by and large, I think there's going to be much more structure around trying to maintain his pocket presence while still recognizing that he's a perfect opportunity in an emergency to be able to get out of situations. But he's got to go through those progressions first before he gets there, instead of going with a hot read and saying, okay, I'm going to go here. And then if that breaks down, now I'm going to run, right? It's learning more what he needs to do with the whole complementary set of players. Now, that also requires a lot of development with timing and chemistry with these wide receivers to be able to make sure that he can trust them, right? There's a lot of opportunities there where this can go for big gains simply because the wide receiver understands what Dampier's doing and Dampier understands what they're doing. And so maybe the route, every wide receiver has some sort of route concept that if something breaks down or it takes too long, they can break out to certain things, but it's much more intuitive in this situation where Dampier can find his guys that he knows he can trust in situations that he needs, right? So I think there's going to be a lot more of that. McGiven said there may be a lot more expanding schemes of the run game. So different styles, different creative things, different things. Maybe it's an RPO, different things to be able to help create some comfortability for Dampier and Bird, but it's trying to maintain what he is successful at. They don't want to take him away as a runner, right? That would be crazy to do it. That's like saying Kyler Murray, we're not going to let him run, or any of these Josh Allen, you're not going to let him run. But as you saw with Josh Allen, even in the NFL, they've developed him these last few years into a much better pocket passer so that he doesn't have to be that guy. He can do that, and he's very fluid and dynamic with that. But at the same time, it's developing him into a complete player to be able to help everything. That's where I think you're gonna get. In terms of Dampier specifically, it really just comes down to better reads, better concepts, going through the progressions. Trying McGiven said it's, quote, "being more in tune with protection," just understanding what you have available to you, right? And understanding kind of how things are supposed to break down. And so it's really pushing Dampier to be able to become I don't want to even say a smarter player because he's a very smart player, but it's taking it to that next level where, and if he can master this, it's going to help his NFL career if he has one. It's creating a more complete player where he can do the things that he needs to in whatever capacity. That's not to say he's going to be perfect, right? He's in college, right? It takes time. This is 1 year where he's going to be under this offensive coordinator. But if it can work with him and Ryan Gunderson, who is the QB coach, which we haven't had a chance to talk to him, and I'm really trying to get a chance to talk to him and to see how they can communicate and connect. This can be a great opportunity for Devin if it works, because I think you take a dynamic player that is done so much, whether it be at New Mexico or at Utah. And now, if you can of take that next level, this could be a breakout season for Dampier, which sounds crazy because Utah fans know what kind of a player he can be. But if you can get him to take that next level, I'm not going to sit here and say Heisman, right? But at the same time, if you can get him to be that and he can do it efficiently, yeah, there may be that kind of talk, right? I don't believe it truthfully, but at the same time, I think that kind of conversation can come around because he is a complete player. And so I think that's what they're trying to do. That's what they want to get him at. I think it's a pretty solid option. We'll see what happens. In terms of Bird specifically, McGiven said it's more just about utilization. How do they get him into the system? Obviously, he's the backup quarterback, and should Dampier need to, take a down off or he gets injured or something, Bird's the guy. But it's not just leaving him on the bench, right? Utah would be crazy to leave a guy with that dynamic ability on the bench or on the sidelines, whatever we want to call it. Basketball, football, it's the same difference. It's trying to figure out all that stuff. So how does he line up? Is he going to be, in the backfield? Maybe he's an option in the run game simply just from the jump. But you utilize that to kind of push different elements of the game. A lot of these offensive coordinators can continue to put different things out there that they may be scheming for later on in the season. Maybe there's another guy that really helps to be able to move forward, and suddenly, teams have been looking at this scheme, and every time Bird does this, he runs. Well, maybe the next time it's a flea flicker, and I don't know. You can, a reverse or something that changes it, and suddenly these teams are caught because they over pursued because they thought that he was going to run, and now you get a deep shot from Bird down, whatever it may be. That's how they want to utilize things. So it's trying to find ways that are going to utilize him that aren't just dummies. And dummies meaning just being a dummy position of, you're kind of on the field because you're in the 11 personnel, and you may try to trick what the defense is looking at, but at the same time, it's utilizing him in a way to actually benefit the team. And so I think you're going to get a lot more of that, and what's going to happen. Really fascinated to see how that goes. I can't get into full specifics of what I have seen in camp, at least in terms of schemes and stuff, but I do know that they want to utilize them both a ton. Dampier is your guy, right? He's your ride or die, the number one guy, but at the same time, Bird Ficklin is knocking on that door, and they want to utilize him. And the benefit here is that Bird and Dampier are completely trustworthy of each other. It's not Bird trying to take down Dampier and trying to steal his job. Yes, Bird wants to be the QB1 eventually, but these two have such great chemistry, and it's genuine. You see them on the field, you see them in public, like they're genuinely best friends, where it now creates a different challenge for defenses to look at if Utah can utilize this correctly. if you can get both of these done effectively, you now have two dynamic athletes out there that have passing capabilities. You've got running capabilities. You've got all sorts of opportunities available to you if they can get it done. So I think it's going to be pretty solid. Really curious to see how this moves forward, what the offense looks like. That's obviously what everybody wants to get. Obviously, the spring game would have been a little taste of that, and you could have gotten some of it. But at the end of the day, I mean, I think this is an opportunity for Utah to improve if they can. Right. I think there's enough about this that McGiven is much more involved with the situations instead of specific spots. He's not trying to scheme something to just quarterback throws to X, quarterback throws to Y. It's much more about situational offense, where if in their 2nd and 11, they have to go to X or X or X. You know what? I'm really using X here. That doesn't really work, but it's getting things so that the players understand the situation of the game and understand what they need to do. There is going to be structure. Don't get me wrong, but it's less mandated or a security blanket because it allows everybody on the field to contribute and to be able to have opportunities to be able to help advance the ball. So really curious there. Now let's transition here to some highlights from spring camp. So we're about the midway point. Utah's had about 7 practices, official practices of teamwork. And so we're at that midpoint, right? And this is about that point where a lot of the players start separating themselves. And that's not to say that some of the players that haven't separated themselves yet won't by fall time. You get a lot of players in fall that suddenly pop off, but most of those guys have had success in spring and have shown something, right? Some of it just may be they pop off later in fall because they're new to the program and it takes a little bit to get in the schemes. But the guys that are starting to pop off now really kind of predict in a lot of ways of what the team can do moving forward. So there has been a lot of good things going on. I think, you know, we got a highlight from Saturday spring scrimmage. This was closed, so the media wasn't invited to this one. But you got a highlight of Kyrie Scholes going for 80 yards on a short little dump off pass from Dampier. One highlight here is that Morgan Scally talked about that run, whereas part of that, Daniel Bray was completely bought into the system and ran as fast as he could downfield alongside Scholes to be able to create a block that opened him up. That's something that Scally, and I'm going to talk about Bray here more in a minute, but that's something that Scally points to of kind of the change of a player that he is and kind of the buy-in from him. So we'll get to that, but I think that shows a lot of what this team can do. They're finding ways to be able to be more dialed in with each other, and that culture has become really strong. Going to practices as a media member right now is, it's much more energetic. And that's not to say that it wasn't energetic under Kyle, like it was, but in a different way. There's like an air of positivity where, don't get me wrong, when we showed up to practice yesterday and watched 20 minutes, there was coaches screaming at some players because they weren't doing it right. This is still football, right? And they're very serious about what they're doing. They want things done correctly. But at the same time, there's a little bit more positivity where when you're on that field, you're giving your all, and you better be working hard and doing what you need to be able to improve this team. But it's also in a way where after that you can let loose and have fun, and it's not so structured in terms of, we got to be like robots. This is a team that feels much more loose and having fun. I mean, like you're getting players that linger around and they're talking a ton to each other and they're just, goofing off essentially and having fun. I don't want to say that wasn't a present in more or Kyle's teams, right? Like that it was. It's just to a different magnitude. I can't really explain that without you seeing it, and I know I can't really show that, but this is a completely different team and a different vibe. So, as Morgan Scally goes, this team goes, and I think he's very intent on trying to create a culture. Now, that's the buzzword that everybody uses, and I hate using culture because that is the buzzword and everybody tries to talk about it, but it's really just creating an identity that everybody buys into. And that's what it comes down to with this team is they're all seemingly on the right page. And you're seeing that with some of these players last year who are taking big steps this year and moving forward. You're seeing it in camp already. You're seeing a much more serious nature. You're seeing guys that are taking it serious in the weight room or taking it serious on the field. They're coming in at appropriate weights and conditioned well. They're not coming in a little bit sluggish or for lack of a better word, lazy. They're coming in ready because they're just amped to be able to be at practice. Practice is hard, but at the same time, they're amped because they're alongside their brothers. They're excited to be there. They can see the vision of this team. And will it amount to a 12-win season? No. But I mean, it could, I guess. But this is something where everybody's pulling in the same direction. And as you saw last year, when the team was pulling in the same direction, which they were for the majority of the season, I can't imagine there was a time where they weren't. But when they were pulling in the same direction, it was a completely different ball game from the prior year. You had a team that was kind of at its wits with each other. They didn't really want to be around each other. Things were going wrong. Everything was a disaster. And by the end of that season, suddenly it felt like Utah football was in the dumps for eternity. Dampier and a bunch of other players come in and change the tone and culture of the team, and suddenly everything was better. That's kind of where you're at this year, where that personality from these players comes out and the energy comes out, and that's what you're seeing. And that's maintained through the entirety of the spring camp. These guys are having fun. I saw them at the baseball game the other day. They're out there hanging out with each other, joking and coming after each other for different things. Like, it's a true team camaraderie that Scally is trying to preach, and so far it's working. Like I said, it doesn't amount to wins per se, but I think when you have a team that is as connected as that, that helps, right? You still have to have talent. You still have to be able to do the things on the field, but that goes a long way in being able to have future success. So with that said, Kyrie Scholes, highlights his. There's a bunch of other players that popped off in spring. The spring scrimmage, we weren't able to see it, so we just had to get that firsthand from Scally, and he talked about how the offense seemingly had the upper hand on Saturday. They were doing really well and had a good day, but then yesterday the defense punched back a little bit. They got some, good things going on there, especially in the second team unit. That defense was absolutely cooking and doing really well. So, there's a lot of give and take. Scally said he loves to be able to have that give and take. He doesn't want one side of the ball, always winning, right? Years past, it was always defense, right? The defense was always winning. The offense was never doing anything. And that kind of mirrored a lot of how the season went. Utah still had success, obviously, but it wasn't dynamic until, Tyler Huntley, Cam Rising, those type of guys came around and started to change it. But that was because they were dynamic players who were just improving the game and kind of changing the style of Utah. But now you're getting much more of the back and forth where the defense is going to shine one day and the offense is going to shine the other. That's what he wants to see. As good as it is to be able to have an offense that's completely dominating every day, that doesn't help your team if you know that you can score points, but your defense can't do anything. So we'll see what that means. There's still a lot to install here. There's still a lot to be able to run through. These guys aren't fully comfortable in the offense or defense. And that's supposed to be expected, right? It's supposed to be able to push them so that by the time they get to fall, they've at least got tape on them to be able to help. Scally, is part of his mantras in here, is he's got to get better mindset. He wants to make sure that these guys are approaching this in the right way where they're not expected to be, perfect players at their position, and they're not supposed to have perfect, technical stuff. They're trying to improve. And as long as they continue to improve and they have the right behavior, that's what he's looking for. Yeah, you have to be able to perform for your brother and you have to be able to do all those things, but you can still make mistakes. And every player is going to make a mistake at a certain time in the field, right? It's just, how do you utilize that to be able to get better? And that's where he's kind of approaching that. So you got that yesterday, just some kind of things that stood out. That defensive line was cooking. Like I said, they had some really great plays that got into the backfield on first and second team. They were active. They clogged lanes. They did not really allow a lot of run game to be able to work. That's not to say things didn't go well for Utah's offense, but that defensive line, probably one of the best I've seen of camp, that in the limited times that we've gotten to see. But really solid work from that defensive line yesterday. A couple guys on offense that shined. There was one from Creed Whittemore who had a great one-handed catch from Dampier. Dampier just completely put it over his shoulder. I reached out and got it. Honestly, looked like it was going to be a incomplete pass because he got a hand on it, but it looked like it slightly a little too far. But Creed, man, he kept with it, bobbled it up to himself, and caught it right before he fell to the ground, and would have picked up some big yards there. So, I think you're seeing some emergence from Creed this year. I've heard a lot of good words from him, and then obviously seeing him in the limited time that we have, I think you're getting a guy that's starting to buy in a little bit more. Not that he wasn't bought in last year, but I think he was limited in what he was doing, and so there's a lot more belief from him that he can get on the field and make an impact. It helps that he now has an wide receiver coach that he's comfortable with when he was at Mississippi State. So that helps you there. Nate Johnson had a little stutter step midway down the field that juked a guy out, and he went for 25-yard touchdown. Great play. It was a nice little catch that he had, and he took it to the house. I think Nate Johnson is really developing as a wide receiver. You're seeing much better play from him. Really fascinated to kind of see him develop this next level. Last year, obviously, was the first year where they utilized him more as the athlete instead of a quarterback. And, he had moments, and obviously some frustrating moments too, where he fumbled the ball. And obviously, under Whittingham, you don't fumble the ball or you don't see the field. This is going to be a little bit different. And I think you're also seeing some confidence from him where he knows that he can kind of be that player now, where he can be a guy that can be an impact player. He's got some shiftiness to him. If he can catch the ball and he can run with it, he's got all the ability in the world to do it. So curious about him. I've seen him at the jugs machine a ton, really just trying to hone in on his craft and get better. Something that we didn't usually get under Kyle Whittingham is some injury updates. And one of those injury updates is Hunter Andrews was back on the field after his injury. So that's not quite an injury update, but I'll get to one in a second. But Hunter Andrews was back on the field for the first time, participating in drills. Really curious to see how he develops and what he can be for that tight end room. Do they, flex him out wide receiver? What do they utilize him as? We just got a glimpse of what he could be last year, and I think you're going to see another emergence from him as he gets, conditioned and into the system. So really fascinated to see how he develops. Maybe by the end of spring we'll get a better update on him, but I think that's a good sign for Utah that he's out there on the field, that he's participating, and that in theory should be seemingly fine for fall. The other one is Kelvin Obot, Utah's 5-star offensive tackle, offensive lineman. He's been playing a little guard lately, but he was banged up a little bit and got injured, an ankle injury. Scally said missed a practice, but he's back out there. So we never got that kind of information, or rarely got that information, and so it's kind of refreshing to hear that. But I think it's good to see that their offensive lineman is still working through it. He's a freshman. It's going to take some time. He's drinking through a fire hose. But by all accounts, it sounds like he's making a lot of progress and working his way up. Whether he'll be a starter this year remains to be seen. I think early that's probably not going to happen, and I'm going to get here to the offensive line shortly. But I think if he can kind of continue to develop, there's real potential that he could potentially push some guys for a starting opportunity. It's going to take time, right? It's coming from high school ranks. You got to be much more physical. It's a taxing toll, so it's tough to be able to get in there, but I think he's making the right strides there. So with that, let's transition a bit to trench play. Scally talked about his exact quote was for the offensive line and the defensive line, quote, "They bring the weather, how they go, we go." And he also said that's where we're going to make our money this year. Not really surprising things there, but at the same time, I think especially this year, this is where Utah really has to hone in. Offensive line, you're replacing 5 new guys, right? You've got guys that are coming in that are fresh. They weren't full-time starters last year, and so it's going to be a difference. On top of that, and this is the big caveat here, is you've got Jordan Gross, who is a first-time offensive line coach at the collegiate level. Coming in from the high school ranks, it's a completely different ballgame. Now, Jordan Gross is completely aware of where he's at. He understands the tall tasks that's in front of him. He even in his interview with us last week, he asked Morgan, he's like, "Are you sure that you want to do this?" He understands it, right? Like he's not out there thinking that he's somehow this great offensive line coach and that he just because he played at the NFL and he played at Utah that suddenly that makes him a great coach. No, he recognizes his situation and he understands where he's at. Now, at the same time, he has Alex Gerke, who coached him at Utah and has been helped, veteran offensive line guy to help him. But at the same time, Jordan Gross is taking this with incredible amount of teaching opportunities where he wants to see how they develop. He's asked them how they learn. He's a technician of the game, so he's going to get in there and teach him what he knows. But it's all going to come to a head in fall when we see how this works. So for me, my projected starters for going into fall, and this is who I think it probably will be when Utah kicks off its first game, is at left tackle, you get Zeraway Williams. I'm just going to run through here also the snaps they took last year. So he had 156 snaps last year. Got on the field, but not a ton, simply because you had a veteran offensive line group that had been together forever. As context here, real quick, last season's offensive line, so those five guys, at minimum, they played 815 snaps together. Now, there's some guys, I think it was Caleb Lomu was it Caleb Lomu? I can't remember, who had the most at 896 snaps. They all had varying degrees of kind of where they were at, but on, basically 815 total snaps combined, that's a lot to lose of guys that just understand they've got the chemistry and do that. As combined, that was 4,200 snaps. It's concurrent, so it's kind of hard to say that, but that's 4,200 snaps combined as a unit to be able to get there. So that's that context, just as kind of a reference points that I go through this. Utah, based on the projected starters that I have, is at 1,875. So 1,800 snaps, almost 1,900 snaps combined. Now, all these guys haven't played together in those five roles, but that's kind of the difference that you're getting. You're getting more than half of the snaps of guys with experience on that line. And one of those guys who has the most snaps is coming from the FCS level. So we'll get there. But anyway, Zeraway Williams, left tackle, 156 snaps last year. A lot of opportunities for him. I think he's going to be a guy that is really going to kind of showcase himself. Has dealt with some injuries over the years, but I think he's on pace to be able to be a really solid asset for Utah. Left guard, Solatoa Moiai, he had 336 snaps last year. Another solid option. He came in, as a good relief guy at guard, whether it be left or right guard. He was able to fill in and do well. So I think, you've got a solid base there of a guy who has experience, and that helps. At center, you got Alex Harrison with 143 snaps. The biggest issue here really comes down to snapping the ball. That's been the biggest issue that Scally has said has taken place. And so if he can get that down, I think he's going to be fine. There's no question about his talent in Utah's minds. It's more just, can he get the ball off correctly? And if not, you've got Isaiah Kemma, who is the transfer from Ohio State, who's coming in. Those two are kind of in that battle for that center position. So, do you go with the veteran who's been at Utah for a long time, who has the ability, who has seen how it works, or do you go with the younger player in Isaiah Kemma, who is fresh to the program, doesn't have a ton of snaps under his belt, but if he's more consistent, does that help? So really curious there. That would be the biggest question in my mind of who fills that role. But I think Harrison right now is kind of the leading guy. And if he can get those snaps taken care of, he's going to be in a good spot. At right guard is going to be Keith Olson. He's had 295 snaps. Another guy that filled in really well for Utah, had a lot of good moments. And, I think you're not, with either of these, Solatoa Moiai or Keith Olson, you're not getting a huge drop off from who they had ahead of them. So I think if they can gel and their chemistry can be there, that's going to be great. And then at right tackle, you've got Cedric Jefferson. This is the transfer for Montana State. He has 945 snaps at Montana State. He obviously was a big component to Montana State, being in the FCF championship game, a great asset, and he's already acclimated to, well, let me caveat that. He's been able to be a great asset for Utah in the sense that he's come in and he's showcased his ability to be on that first line. Now, with that said, there is a transitionary period of being able to move from the FCS level and FBS. And part of that more is just kind of understanding that football is much more the business side of it, right? FCS, you don't have the full-time staff that's able to help you to the level that a Power 4 program can. And so for him, he talked to us yesterday, for him, it's getting it getting football to be kind of an everyday type of thing. It's understanding kind of your role and how you fit into it. And it's not to say that he doesn't understand that. It's really just kind of getting this to be, or getting up to the level that he needs to be able to be consistent, right? And so there's a little bit of a learning curve. There's still a little bit of things to be able to help him get there, but you're already seeing him in those first units where he's able to make his case. And so I think, if he can get to that on a consistent basis, Utah's going to be fine. I think they've got a great option at right tackle. Yeah, you don't have Spencer Fano there, but I don't know that Cedric Jefferson, it's hard. I don't want to say it's not a huge drop off, because that is a huge drop off, because Spencer, Fano is obviously going to be a first round guy, but I think you have a guy that is more than capable of being able to fill the role there and help Utah. So really fascinated. I think that's the group that you're probably going to get for your offensive line. It's going to change. Alex Harrison told us yesterday that he thinks it's probably about 5 or 6 different guys that can fit in that unit. So this feels like that unit, and then there's 1 or 2 guys that he believes, and that's kind of the consensus as well, of who could gel moving into that line. Kelvin Obot obviously being one of those guys that could potentially get into that starting unit, but he's got to develop some more physicality, just kind of get that strength that is needed to be able to compete at this level. But he's got what it needs to. It's just, you know, he's got to get up to speed. And then, as I mentioned, Isaiah Kema. So we'll see what happens there. In terms of other backups, you've got Isaiah Garcia, Roger Alderman, Reese Parmenter, and Soren Scheinefeld. You're going to have them as an opportunity there. Now, part of this, and they're going to be listed as tight ends, but they're called rhinos, right? These are the guys that that are really changing things for Utah, because Utah hasn't fully had this at their disposal, and most programs don't to this level. Because you've got big guys that could go be fullbacks or tight ends, whatever you want to call them, but they're kind of a mixture of both, where they're athletic, they're big, but at the same time, they're also shifty. And that is Semi Taulanga, which you saw a lot of him last year lining up in the backfield, changed a lot for the game, pass blocking, whatever it may have you. Got some passes last year. I'm really fast. I really want to see more from him. I think that would be great. And then you got Sione Motupuaka, who is also going to be in that situation. So both of these guys are the rhinos. Scally describes them. This is his quote. He says, quote, nastiness, mean, aggressive football, and they're athletic. Just when you think they're going to just pound your face in, they slip out on a slide route, and they've got good hands. So these are 2 players, and McGiven talked about them as well, as trying to figure out how to utilize them, because he's never really had players like them, figuring out how to utilize them in a way that is beneficial. When he talks about great hands, there's some drills that I've seen where these guys are going up for balls and catching them, and then suddenly you've got this guy that has to go tackle him. Like, it's just so hard. Like Scally said, lining up against them on one-on-one drills is a nightmare, and these players take full advantage of it. They're shifty, they're great. Now they're bigger bodies, so it's not like they've got this like running back shiftiness, but for their size, yeah, they're hard to bring down. They've got abilities. So you mix them with that offensive line. These are 2 guys that were expected to be defensive tackles. They come here. They've got a different mindset on what they can do. This is a great opportunity for Utah to add a little bit more beef back there to help that offensive line. And it's not that they fully, you had that last year, but it's not that you fully need it, but it's going to be a benefit, especially if you can get them in, pass catching opportunities. Obviously you can only have a certain amount, but if you can get them in there, I think that's going to be very beneficial. Going a little long here, so I'm going to speed through a lot of these different things. Defensive ends, Scally says they're going to be a solid group. He honestly glossed over them because he just feels so confident in what they can be. A lot of that's Lance Holtzclaw, Cash Dillon, Ethan Day, Paul Fitzgerald, maybe Elijah Ellis, who's been in the linebacker room, but he comes in. There's going to be a lot of opportunities there. There's also, on the defensive tackle room, that's a little bit more of a question, but Jere Moe, let me pull this up right here. If I can put this up, this is just to kind of show him, comes in from San Jose State. Scally praised him a ton. He loves him as a player. He says, quote, he provides a little bit of athleticism and twitch and the ability to slant and do some things with him. Alex Harrison said he's one of the toughest players that they've had to go up against. And he says he is twitchy, explosive, really good with his hands, and he's a smart player. He's one of the only people I know that can. He can really fill out in the pass rush, move over to the run block where you're at. You really can be able to counter off of how he's feeling when where you're moving. So there's a lot of praise for Moe. I think there's going to be a lot of noise around him coming into fall camp. I think he's a high energy guy. He's a guy that does really well, and I think you're going to see a lot of opportunities for him. Next to him is two guys that have already been in that room, and it's Carson Kafusi and Pupu Sepulona. But Scally wants to see them move from that freshman to the sophomore realm in terms of being able to take that step up. They clearly have the talent to be able to do what they need to, but it's now moving into that next realm where they can be kind of those dynamic players that Utah needs them to be. They've got talent. That's not the question. It's more taking it to that next level, and that's where he wants to see them. They have the measurables, and especially for Carson. I mean, he is a specimen. Honestly, like I don't know another way to say that, and I don't want to sit here and glaze him over here, but at the same time, like he is a specimen. It's just now a matter of being able to put that together as a guy that can kind of take that next step, be more physical, be smarter on the field. Not that he's not smart, but you know what I'm saying? Like trying to get him to that next level of where Utah needs him to be. But his leadership has been great. They said he was a surprise guy where they didn't necessarily expect him to be a leader of the team, mostly because he's kind of quiet at first, but he's completely stepped up and he's been a major vocal leader as well as a guy on the field. So really curious to see where that goes. Let's end here with the running backs. We can get to a bunch of other position groups later, but let's go with the running backs because that's what we talked about yesterday. Wayshawn Parker is that guy. And you're seeing, I will say, one of the first days that we got to watch spring camp, you saw a completely different Wayshawn in the sense of he looks bigger. He looks much more bought in. Not that he wasn't bought in last year, but there's just something different about him in terms of how he's approaching this. He seems to be in shape. He's ready to go, and you see a guy that feels confident that he's RB1, and he's backing that up on the field. He's doing great work there. Scally said he's going to give everything he's got on the field, but he's done everything that he can be to be a guy that can make something out of nothing if they need to. So now you've got Dampier, you've got Bird, you've got Wayshawn. Excuse me. You got Wayshawn. You've got a lot of guys in the backfield that can do a lot of good things. And so, a lot of positivity about who he can be. Daniel Bray, I mentioned him earlier, and Scally talked about that run, that Kyrie Scholes run, that really impressed him. But as part of this, Scally said the biggest positive so far is him. This is a guy who comes in as a freshman, and I think there's always this belief that you're going to get to play. And there's moments that he got to that West Virginia game. He jumped in there and you saw his shifting. I mean, this is one of the most shifty, fast guys on the team, and you saw what he can do. But he kind of got limited in a lot of what he was able to do on the field because they just kind of forgot him in a lot of respects. And some of that is, him being a freshman. Some of that is his buy into the program. Not that he wasn't bought in, but it's more just kind of like, how does he fit in with the rest of the team? And you're seeing much more of that, Scally said. You're seeing a guy who's bought in. You're seeing a guy who has built up his frame. He's buying into the culture, and it's all kind of translating on the field. Kevin McGiven said that he's one of those players that he wants to do more with. He wants to find ways to get him utilized on that field more. So I think you're going to see a lot more Daniel Bray this year. How that comes to be remains to be seen. But I think there's going to be a lot more emphasis on utilizing him and especially his speed. I'm really fascinated to see what they can do that's different because you've got Wayshawn that is much more of kind of your tried and true running back, downhill runner guy, but you've got Bray who can just beat you with speed, and so I'm really fascinated to see what comes about with that, what it can be. But I mean, the fact that Scally said he's one of the biggest positives of camp kind of shows what kind of jump that he's made. And I'll end here with these two, Steve Chavez Soto and LaMarcus Bell. So Chavez Soto, comes as the top rusher from San Jose State, 500 yards. And then LaMarcus Bell comes in as a true freshman. Both of these guys, they've been really solid in camp and what we've seen, but also in what Scally said. But the next thing for them is becoming much more of a complete running back. And part of that is in their pass catching abilities. Scally said he wants them to be able to be much more apparent in that aspect of the game because he doesn't want to give off tells, right? Oh, LaMarcus Bell's in. That means we're going to put him in third and short, whatever that may be. He wants to find ways where he can utilize either one of these players in both assets of the game, whether it's pass catching, whether it's rushing. It's being able to make them complete players as well to not have these telltale signs, right? And you saw that a lot last year, and you've seen it over the years with Kyle Whittingham, where there was a lot of telltale signs of, okay, this guy's in. N'Kerry Rogers would come in, and it's like, well, it's third and short. We got to get those yards. And some of that's going to be by design anyway. Guys, teams expect you to run on those situations. So it's not like you're removing all the telltale signs, but it's trying to make it so that there's a little bit more flexibility there, where maybe you see Chavez Soto out there lining in back there with Wayshawn. What does that mean, and how does that work? Can you get something out of that, or is it just tough for these defenses to figure out? So that's where they're trying to get it. They're at the jugs machine a lot, trying to work on their hands and trying to be able to become better pass catchers. But by and large, it's been positivity from this group. With Wayshawn there leading the charge, and especially with him stepping up in the leadership role, Utah's in good hands. But beyond that, you've got Daniel Bray, who's going to be, this dynamic player. Chavez Soto has carried the load for a team before, but he wants to do more. LaMarcus Bell, it's just really kind of acclimating to that level, but he's had some standout moments as well. How does this group all fit together? And I think it's really fascinating to see how this all works. You pair that with Dampier and Bird. You pair that with the Rhinos. You pair that with the new offensive line. You now pair that with the wide receivers that have improved, and we're going to touch on those at another time. All of this comes together into being a great asset for Utah if it all comes together, right? This can, I don't want to oversell things, because there's a lot going on here where Morgan Scalley's a new coach. Jordan Gross is a new coach. You've got, a team that is replacing all 5 starters on the offensive line. This isn't going to just be a plug and play situation and Utah's suddenly 12-0. It could happen, but it's not one of those where you can guarantee it. There's a lot of things that have to go right, and all of it has to go right at the same time in a lot of respects, right? And if one of those breaks down, that's where you're going to see the turmoil. That's where you're going to see Utah have to be shifty and figure out with what they need to do and adaptable. What can they be? I think they have the right personnel to do that, but we won't know that until fall. We won't know that until they face that adversity when something bad goes wrong, or whatever they thought that they had as a strength doesn't turn out to be, or maybe it does. That's where this is going to take off and emerge. But I think as we're getting to the midway point of spring camp, I think Utah's in a great spot on the offensive side of the ball. I think there's more concerns on the defensive side of the ball, though those are more temporary. But I think Utah's in a good spot here, and I think you should be positive about what this offense can be. Like I said, it all has to hit, but I think there's a lot of positivity about what this offense can be. Before I end this, I just want to give a shout out to Utah baseball. Man, this is a team that is working hard. They're finding a lot of chemistry and rhythm together. Pitching still needs to be improved. These are high-scoring games, but Utah just got a sweep over Kansas State over the weekend, and then last night got a win over Utah Valley in a 15-9 game where there was a grand slam from Cameron Gurney, 6 runs in the 9th inning. I mean, this is a team that's really doing well with their bats. It's just a matter of being a complete team. But that's put Utah in the middle of the Big 12 standings, and so really fascinated by this baseball team. It's been great to be able to see a game up there and kind of see how this home stadium environment helps. I think there's a different vibe and energy there as well. So really fascinated to see how this baseball team works. So with that, we're going to sign off today. We'll try to get a few more of these out there. I want to try to do these a little bit more consistently during spring camp, but busy. So with that, we'll sign off today. Hope you have a great day, and we will chat with you later.